Hello and welcome to the Beyond Podcast. And today we are going to be talking about plays, specifically plays in paper form, because once upon a time, the people invented printing. And they thought they'd take this whole play thing and try and translate it into paper form for other people to read at their own convenience and time. And it sort of ticked over in the beginning of the 16th century, and then it sort of gets a bit more interesting later on as the variety of plays change from things that might be good for you to plays that are just fun and entertaining and weird. And we're going to probably cover the weird today. In terms of the text we're going to dance around today is going to be Fair M, the Miller's Daughter of Manchester. But we're not necessarily going to be diving too deeply into that, though there may be some spoilers ahead. But to join me in this discussion, mostly about the person responsible for giving us a copy of the text, John Danter, I am joined by my special guest today. Who are you and what is your purpose in life?
That's a very deep question. Not one I'm sure I can answer this evening, but I can tell you who I am. I am Michel. I am a PhD student at the University of Birmingham, specifically the Shakespeare Institute, and I'm doing my thesis on John Danter, which sounds like it's going to be very handy this evening.
Yes. So, John Danter. Let's start with Danter, because there's a play. We'll worry about the play later. So, who was John Danter? Because it's fair to say anyone who's heard of John Danter may not have the best opinion of his reputation, of who he was. But before we get to the lies, let's get to the who is John Danter to you?
So John Danter was an early modern printer publisher. He's born roughly 1564 and starts to do a 7-year apprenticeship under a man called John Day in the mid 1580s. I think it was 1581. But his apprenticeship was somewhat spoilt. His master, John Day, died, which makes it quite difficult to complete an apprenticeship under a particular master. And after 2 years of not having a master, not having any work to print, Danter and a group of other printers were involved in the illegal printing of somebody else's patent, which is partly where he gets his reputation that you're alluding to from. He was then swept up by another master printer, Robert Robinson, who continued to train him until 1591. And at that point, he became a free man of the Stationers' Company and went into partnership with other printers, William Hoskins and Henry Chettle, and went on to be quite a significant cog in the wheel of early modern stationers who were responsible for bringing early modern play texts to St. Paul's Churchyard, which was kind of the main book hub during those days. And he was kind of a key part, or definitely one of the main parts of what I call the boomlet, 1594 boomlet, where there was a sharp increase in playtext, and a lot of those are ones that we are aware of and know today. So I think he's a bit of a hero, really. I think he is kind of forgotten as being one of those people who was responsible for bringing those playtexts into print, and instead that incident of piracy had kind of muddied his reputation. But from what I can see, he was a person who worked hard, did well to help the wardens of the Stationers' Company approve of him as a printer. He was banned after that incident from ever being a master printer, but actually he was able to overturn that and still become a free man of the Stationers' Company. So he must have been doing something right, surely.
You've danced around a lot of things
Yes.
to do with the world of printing. Let's start by sort of painting a little bit of a picture in the 1580s, 1590s. You mentioned St. Paul's Churchyard. St. Paul's is, of course, the old version of St. Paul's. It has a much more expansive footprint than the version we have today. It has precincts. It has places where you can buy things. And it is sort of the bookseller's alley is specifically sort of one area and is this sort of hub of activity at the time. So we've got people printing material. Material is potentially owned by people. How does that work? Because they don't have quite the same idea of copyright as we do today, do they?
No, they absolutely don't. So in order to print, and I'm going to speak specifically from a printer, publisher, stationer's perspective, and I'm more than happy to expand those terms shortly for you. If you are an author and I say to you, that manuscript looks wonderful, how about I purchase it from you and give you some money, and you give me that manuscript, that is now mine. It's not your intellectual property. You do not hold any copyright over that. That is just for me. I can then register that with the stationer's company who oversee the printing of everything and have it written into the stationer's register as belonging to me. And that then prohibits anybody else from printing that same text. And that becomes up to me. If I sell it and it sells out, then I can print another run. I can print as many runs as I want. I own that manuscript. I don't need to go back to the author to say, we're going to do a rerun. Would you mind if I pay you more money? As soon as the manuscript has been handed over, that is now in the possession of the publisher, not the author.
Yes, and that's the printing rights that are owned.
Yes.
That's not necessarily the same as the performing rights, because the performing rights technically don't exist. There does seem to be an honour system or a dishonour system that exists with players, that you don't half-inch somebody else's play, but that does get fiddly and complicated if, for example, various players think that they effectively own a text. And of course, physical ownership of copies of plays becomes something that's very important to different playing companies around this time. I think that sort of covers that sort of general shape of that world. The stationer's company, what do they do? What is their job within this world?
So the Stationers' Company starts in 1403, but by about 1556, they become a more significant governing body over printed materials. And this means that they have the right to kind of monitor and police anything that is printed. If someone owns a patent, which is where they have permissions to print a particular type of text, the Stationers' Company can then enforce any breaches of that. So we spoke earlier briefly about Danter printing somebody else's patent. There were grammar and Latin texts that were patented to somebody else. Danter had printed those, therefore breaching what was in the stationer's company's stationer's register. They weren't his to print, and therefore it was up to the stationer's company to burn the items that he had printed and to punish him for that, whether that's a fine. Sometimes they had their equipment stolen, sometimes they were imprisoned, but they were the people who monitored and controlled the printing of text in London.
Yeah, and so just final thing, just to make sure everybody in all the listeners are sort of very much on the same page before we get into something a bit more discursive. There's a bit of a distinction between printer and publisher as well, that you can sometimes trip over, and it can be a bit wibbly wobbly. It can be sometimes very precise. What is the distinction, and is there a difference?
Okay, so if you became a free man of the stationer's company, then you are technically a stationer. That's what you are. You are a stationer. However, whilst they were known more generally as stationers then, now in kind of modern literature, we try to pull the roles apart so that we understand a bit more who was involved and how. So now we see a printer, almost like you would see your printer at home, the machine, the thing that creates the text. And of course, their machines were very different. They were like early hand presses, but the printer would be the person who had the manuscript, had a person called a compositor put together all the letters and shape them in a form ready to be printed, and then create the physical book. So the printer was the person who physically created the book. The publisher is seen more generally as kind of the money man, perhaps the person buying the manuscript from an author, the person then securing a trade deal with a bookseller to then sell those books on in bulk. If they didn't shift, then finding somebody else and then funding the materials to print it. So one kind of dynamic that could exist is you have a publisher who is finding people with manuscripts to print. They purchase a manuscript and then they send it off to a trade printer, who is someone who literally just acts as a printer. They create the physical book, it goes back to the publisher, and then the publisher finds who's going to sell it. So they are kind of the coordinator, the financier. They are the person who organizes everything that is happening there. But where it gets messy is there is nothing stopping a printer getting to know an author and saying, how about I give you some money for that manuscript? and then they are publishing and printing that item themselves. They can also sell that item themselves if they have a stall out the front of their shop, or they can find a bookseller themselves. So this is where it starts to get blurry. There are also instances of booksellers publishing. You have someone coming in to see their copy of their book on the stall and go, oh, I've got another manuscript that I think would sell just as well. And the bookseller goes, well, I happen to have a printing press. Let me help you out with that. So this is where it muddies. Stationer covers all of those kind of distinct parts because they do kind of get a bit grey. But now we pull them apart so that we can understand what role we think each person played.
And what is John Danter's role in that Venn diagram?
Everything. So Danter works with two of the biggest publishers at the time. They are Cuthbert Berbie and William Barley, and he works for them as a trade printer. But he does also publish smaller items. So we're talking about ballads, which tended to just be a one-sheet page with a song on it, or pamphlets. And we spoke about the coney catching pamphlets previously, because he knew the authors himself, so he didn't need to go through a publisher. There is also evidence to suggest that he was buying play manuscripts and selling them on to Cuthbert Berbie, his publisher, and then Berbie was using him as the printer. So it does get quite messy trying to untangle precisely everybody's role in each text.
Yes, and for those who'd like to catch us chatting about coney catching pamphlets, that is over on the Patreon feed. That unless you have to give us money for that, but that's one of our exclusive releases on occasional Mondays. But you can hear us nattering away about the terrible things people do to each other in a life of crime. Right, anyway, back to John Danter. Plug over. So we're almost at John Danter. I just want a little bit more context. I mentioned earlier that plays have been being printed from the beginning of the 16th century, but it's not big business so far as we can tell, and the texts that are often being chosen are sort of dialogues or moral interludes or things that look like they might be instructive and terribly worthy. And of course, the playing world changes in the Elizabethan and becomes much more diverse in what's going on in the public sphere, and it seems to take a while for printers to figure out what to do with that. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so. I think one of the other problems as well is so I have this all mapped out, and you're absolutely right. From about 1512, there's this trickle of play text coming out, and you're absolutely right that most of these are instructional, moral. Because they're printed and they're relatively small. They'd be in quarto format, which is birthday card size. That's how I remember it. They would then be able to be carried around everywhere, which is why they were useful. However, when you get into the late 60s, 70s, and then into 80s, get to the 90s, and there's this massive spike in printed playtext. And now there are, by this stage, I think about 5 or 6 different playhouses opening in London. Playgoing is becoming increasingly popular. There's a really small spike, I think, in about 1591, where it's almost like printers are dabbling with the idea of printing some of these performance plays as opposed to kind of religious or morality plays, or even,
so you're sort of thinking Senecan tragedy and things like that?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, because in the earliest years of Elizabeth, there's suddenly this boom as they sort of work their way through the Senecan tragedies.
Yeah.
And then that gets collated in, 1581, I think.
Yes.
Even though they were sort of individual projects. It's also interesting, in the early years of Elizabeth, it's like everybody's clearing out their cupboard of old moral plays because technically you're not really supposed to perform them anymore, because you're not really supposed to talk about God on stage. It's something that Elizabeth increasingly stamps down on. And so I wonder if actually everyone's just sort of run out of plays that they can publish that are of that type, because then there just isn't the same sort of market for them anymore.
Yeah, quite possibly. And I think the rise in performances, the rise in playgoing, and the opening of more playhouses probably also inspired this kind of spike in playtext printing. In 1591, there are more plays printed in one year than had been in the previous several decades. By the time we get to 1594, there are suddenly 20 plays printed in one year, whereas previous decades hadn't been 20 at all. So
Mm.
1594, there is this spike. Printed playtext didn't sell out immediately. This isn't, I'm sure we can all think of books that have gone on sale and everyone's queuing outside their local bookshop and waiting to get the book on release day. That absolutely wasn't the case here. And quite often it could take years for books to sell. Some of them went back for pulping and then recycling into new books. But actually, it took a while for the market to establish. And so you have this tiny peak in 1591. Then they have another try in 1594. And then as you get into the late, I feel like a weather girl with my arms sweeping. As you get into the late 1590s, there's this much, much bigger peak. And into the early 1600s, playtext really become quite popular. This 1594 peak is the one that Danter is really quite involved in, and he prints a quarter of the text printed in that year that are playtext. So he's heavily involved. He's working with Cuthbert Burby, who is also kind of a big printer, as well as several other works as well. So Dante's right there in the thick of it, adding to the number of playtexts that are coming out. And one of the reasons I think this spike has happened, and there are probably other people who have similar ideas, is that printers were really, really poor. And we're talking extreme poverty. One of the reasons that printers were printing other people's patented texts illegally is because they simply didn't have any other options. They had trained for 7 years to kind of learn their trade and didn't have other skills to put towards other work. This was their one means of being able to generate work and generate money. And that meant in a London where there were far more printers than there were manuscripts to print, early modern printers needed to forge a new market. They needed to find something else that they could print that was potentially not going to run out. And as you were saying earlier, Senecan tragedies, we've done those. Religious texts, well, that's a bit awkward now, and particularly Catholic texts at this particular time. And so finding playtext as something that could really pick up, especially as people are attending more plays, kind of scratched that itch for early modern printers. It meant that they had this whole market of text that they could print. Nobody else had really picked up those early modern plays and printed them. And that meant that there was nobody else to compete with. Nobody else had registered those texts in that station as registered and claimed them. And so there were no rivals, which is what they needed. And it was a really significant time for early modern printers to suddenly have this whole field of we've got 6 or 7 different playhouses, all with different plays on. They've got vast repertories. We've got lots of different things to choose from here, and we haven't got any competition apart from ourselves. And they worked in this network where they would have a publisher who would then disseminate the plays down to a handful of trade printers. Some of those trade printers would work for 2 or 3 different publishers working together. But between them, it meant that they had a better workload, not necessarily one that meant that they were particularly well off, but it certainly meant that they could feed themselves, they could feed their families, and it was sustainable. And new plays were constantly being written, being performed. And so it meant that they had found this corner of the market that was not being utilized.
And plays aren't excessively long. They are not, okay, they're not quite pamphlets, but they're not massive tomes. So there is also that thing of something you can potentially turn around relatively quickly. But also, just on that note, and it's not it's a thought that's been thrown at that particular spike in play printing before. We've coming out the other side of a very bad plague year. And one of the things I thought about, and I don't know if this is an original idea or not, coming out of our plague year was, everyone was going, oh, we must do theatre, we can't do theatre, we'll do it on Zoom. And I was wondering whether actually there's an awful lot of booksellers maybe selling whatever random stock they've got because people miss plays and going, ooh. Because the other side that people put is that theatre companies are desperate for money and are selling off old plays that they're not using anymore. But I do wonder if there's actually a market spike of interest spike that's coming the other direction, coming from actually the audience who can't go to plays anymore because all the playhouses are shut, and just clearing out potentially booksellers of whatever not vast selection of plays that are available from the 1570s and 80s, where there really was a bit of a dearth of new material being distributed.
Yeah, I certainly think this is an area I'm currently working to explore. It's looking into what did cause that spike. And you're absolutely right, 1593 was a very, very poor year for plague going because of the plague. And there are many thoughts behind this. Some people think that, as you were saying, the playhouses weren't generating any money and therefore were looking to sell their manuscripts in the hope that that would at least bring some money in. My own thought on that is that manuscripts didn't sell for very much, as opposed to having a theatre, bums on seats, and selling tickets every night. I don't know that selling a singular manuscript, or even if you sold a whole chunk of them, I don't know that that would bring in an awful lot of money. I do like the idea of booksellers going, right, let's have a clear out. What have we got? But we also need to think about those new plays that are being printed as well. One theory that I have read is that William Barley, who was also a draper, was friends with another draper who was just about to open the Rose Theatre. And Barley seems to print a lot of the Queen's Men's plays, and the Queen's Men were at the Rose. So is there a link there? Is he trying to promote the reopening? Other thoughts people tend to have is this a way of kind of rebranding, advertising plays now that they're going to come out? And these are all things that I'm considering, but I'm also trying to view them from the printer's perspective because, I mean, as a wannabe academic, I know that I can visit any publisher and say, "Hi, I have a manuscript. Could you print it?" Doesn't mean they have to.
Mm.
They still need to make that business decision as to, and particularly printer publishers who are struggling financially, printing a text, even though plays are relatively short, still going to be time, money on materials, and if it doesn't sell, there's no guarantee they're getting anything back. So actually, I think we need to think about the agency of the publishers here as well. You can buy manuscripts until, the cows come home, but if they aren't going to sell, if they aren't going to make you any money, that's not going to keep you in business. And so what I'm currently exploring is how these networks, and it appears there's about 8 or 9 different printer publishers all kind of throwing themselves into this market at this point. There must have been conversations, something, and whether that is, bumping into players or other people involved in the theatre companies more directly and going, hey, we're struggling, so are we. How can we work through this together? That may well be the case. But I certainly think from the publisher's perspective or the printer's perspective, there are definitely conversations around how they can work together to build this market. We can't find out how long they sat in bars discussing with each other or with players or anybody else. We can't know that. And obviously, players and theatre companies were involved from their end. But I think we do need to consider that publishers don't need to print things, especially if they don't think they're going to make them any money.
Mm.
So yeah, I think I've just repeated myself about 6 times, but
No.
that's
It's a good point, and it's why I set it up. Because there are some received wisdoms that I think that need to be shaken, or at least people do like to look for one reason rather than that actually there are several incentives and disincentives for things to happen. So let's look at Danter prints some plays. You've mentioned some of them. We mentioned at the top Fair M, the Miller's Daughter of Manchester. So that is a play printed, 1592, 93-ish, that sort of area?
I think 1593. Yeah, I can explain my number if you wish.
Oh, please do, because let's get into the nitty-gritty. This is a play that is being printed by John Danter. What sort of job of work is he doing with it? What sort of materials has he got? What does he turn it into?
So he obviously would have had a manuscript, which he would have then composed, which means taking the tiny letters, lining them all up, putting them in a form, and printing them. It's printed on standard laid paper, and the ink would have been purchased locally. It's a typical Danter style play. They all look relatively similar with regards to layout. But the thing that interests me about this one, and the reason I say 1593, is that as part of my studies, I've taken on the onerous task of tracking every single damaged piece of type printed in Dante's books. Now, a piece of type is a singular letter on a piece of lead. So it's like a rectangular, long, thin rectangular piece of lead, about an inch long. And on the end is a letter shape, which when you apply ink and push it down, it's like a stamp. And you put all of those together, reflecting the words that you are intending to print, put ink on them, push the paper on, and the impression is readable. Now, some of these type have got really distinguishing nicks or bumps or bangs or chunks out of them. And so you can track these particular letters, damaged ones, across books. And I've found that Dante has two very specific cases of type where I have done this work over most of his career, most of the things that he has printed, every extant copy. What I'm finding is that things are either printed with case A or case B. There doesn't seem to be any kind of crossover between the two cases of type. So these are two sets of letters that he would have used potentially in different rooms, is the suggestion to me, given that there's no crossover in, the T with the missing top seems to find its way into some of the books, for example. That doesn't happen. But case B only starts being used in 1594. And so for Fair M to have been printed, say, in 1591, which is, I know, one of the ideas, one of the theories, it doesn't make sense that Dante would have had that case of type 3 years earlier, used it once, and then stopped altogether, whereas late 1593 makes a lot more sense. Standish Hennings points out that in 1593, so the 25th of September 1593, the fourth Earl of Derby died. This meant that his son, Lord Strange, inherited his title and became the fifth Earl of Derby upon his father's death. And the title page of Fair M states that it was played by Lord Strange and his servants. So this suggests that this was printed earlier than Lord Strange's succession to his father's title in September 1593. So the second reason is that Fair M names a bookseller as being Thomas Newman. So Thomas Newman had stopped trading, we believe, in the middle of 1593. The 30th of June is the last time that we see his name in the stationer's register. He registers the Three Witches of Warboys. However, it was then sold by somebody else, Thomas Mann, which suggests that Newman was no longer trading as a bookseller for the later half of 1593. Because case B doesn't show up in any other of Dante's texts until 1594, early 1594, it must have been used in 1593. Otherwise, he's holding on to a case of type and not printing when he could be until 1594. It doesn't make sense to be holding on to a case of type for nearly a year or 2-3 years and not using it, especially when you need to make money and could be printing ballots, for example, and at least bringing something in.
I'm just curious now on the just investigating the type in the sense of, can you detect ongoing wear and tear? Like you can tell how, this is this wonky bit of type at the end of its lifetime, and can you figure out when they knackered it?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually in Wounds of Civil War, on the bottom page of one of the pages, there is a capital C in the bottom corner. I've looked at all of the extant editions. I think there are 11, and in 4 of them the C is crushed, but in the other 7 it isn't. So you can see that during the printing of Wounds of Civil War, that particular C is crushed. And so anything I find now with that crushed C in it, I know was printed after the second half of Wounds of Civil War. But there are also letters that you see kind of slowly kind of wear down and become nothing but a nub, and then presumably get thrown away after a while. And that's been part of my work as well, is trying to use that damage, that wear and tear, to establish the order that things were printed. It also helps me to determine which parts of the books were not printed by Danter. Sometimes printers would share printing. This would mean that part of the text, say the first half was printed by Danter, the second half printed by somebody else. And you might do that because you want something to be printed quicker. So if you only do half and somebody else does half in parallel to you, then it goes out quicker. It might be, as Danter kind of discovers in 1594, he has so much work all of a sudden that he can't manage it, and therefore is asking other people to do the printing for him. So there are different options, and being able to trace that type helps me to identify what is his and what is somebody else's.
So what sort of, with Fair M, I mean, you're talking about, Wounds of Civil War, another play that we've covered, that, damage occurs over time. But in terms of laying out and presenting the text of Fair M, what sort of job of work does he do? I mean, is it a good print, as it were? That's not necessarily to question the quality of the play, which is an entirely separate question about the manuscript that he might have acquired. But in terms of how he's actually dealt with it, what sort of work has he done?
Okay, I was going to say the dealt with it is quite a loaded question, but the work that he has done, um, what he would have had to do is to take the manuscript, to divide it up, just marking on the pages what he thinks will fit onto a single sheet of page per a page. And then what he would have done is, so you have a sheet of paper and you fold it in half like a birthday card and you fold it in half again to make it a quarter. That's called a quarto. And what Dante would have needed to do is print on one side of that and then the other. And if you fold a piece of paper at home and do that, you'll see that the pages that you want to print on don't line up. And in fact, on one side of the page, you have, so if you fold your piece of paper like that, so birthday card, and then fold it again, so it's now in quarters, write your page numbers 1 to 8 on it and then open it back out, you'll find that pages numbers 1 and 8 are next to each other on the same side of the sheet as 4 and 5. And then on the other side, you have 2, 3, 6, and 7. So Dante would have needed to figure out 8 pages worth of text to then put onto those quires and set up 1, 8, 4, and 5 at the same time as each other, and then 2, 3, 6, and 7. And this can have an impact on how the play is printed. Because if you underestimate, overestimate, you then end up in situations where something that should be verse is now suddenly prose because you kind of decided that more words should go on it than actually can fit, or that you're filling the gap with different decorative ornaments to kind of space fill. And what has happened is that scholars have looked at these as interpretations of script as opposed to a printer going, oh no, we've left a massive gap. How are we going to fill it? I'll just chuck a ornament in it. It'll be fine. From that respect, I think Fair M comes out quite well. There don't appear to be any kind of major printing hiccups like that. It's well presented, it's well printed, but it's also not printed in the same regard something like Fox's Book of Martyrs or these other big beautiful books that would have gone on people's bookshelves. At the end of the day, a play text was just something that people were going to read and then probably throw away, which is why we don't have, they would have kept it for a while, but it wouldn't have been kind of a keeper on someone's bookshelf.
Yes, and also just for the listeners at home, it's even more of a, I'm trying to think of a non-rude way of saying this. I'm going to say it anyway. It's even more of a mind, because of course, all the words are the wrong way round. All the letters are the wrong way around. You have to put all the words together backwards, and then put the pages in the order that they need to go in, which are not the order that they would appear that you would see looking at the page. So you have to think backwards, sideways, and every which way but loose to produce a book, and it's incredibly complicated. And it hurts my brain to think about it.
If you think as well that these were tiny lumps of lead and they're about an inch long with very, very small, you can see the size of letters on your page. That is the size of the end of one of these pieces of lead. The conditions that they're working in, they didn't have electricity. This is by candlelight or window light. And sometimes you pick up the wrong letter. You may have put them, they had a big case of type which was divided into different sections for each letter. Letters that were more frequent, for example, an E would have a larger section, so you could have more E's, whereas a Z there might be less. Now, this means that if you have a text where you have a character and who needs a prefix with a Z in their name, you're going to run out of Zs. So instead of Z, you might get a 2. You might get something that vaguely resembles a Z because the printer simply doesn't have enough Zs. Another issue that can take place is that when you are putting the type back, you've already printed everything, you're now putting the type back into the case, ready to go again. Sometimes an O or an E or a C might look the same under a particular light, and you could distribute them back into the wrong section. So then when you go to set up again the next day and you're collecting your letters, you don't think to check every single letter and you might pick up a letter that's incorrect. So think of long S's and F's can look very similar. U's and N's, and you might put them the wrong way up. That's another issue. But when it comes to reading these texts, then you can't always rely on the letters that you can see as being the correct letters, because it may be the case that the printer, who is acting in a completely functional human way, is just selecting the letter he thinks is in that box, putting it in upside down, or somehow otherwise incorrectly. When we are looking at these play texts, we need to consider how they were produced in order to understand their actual meaning. And the printers, as much as I hate to say it, didn't necessarily care too much about
Well,
preserving that meaning or reflecting it as accurately as they could.
yeah, well, and again, in the case of a text like Fair M, where the print run is not necessarily enormous, and is not a big volume like, Fox's Acts and Monuments, where with a big printing like that, there is a sort of ongoing revision process,
Yes.
clearly sort of designed that you're going to have someone proofreading early sheets and course correct as you go. Now, with a printing like Fair M, the disincentive to do that, or with any of these shorter runs, is probably higher, that you might do some initial checking, but actually that kind of error, it might not be enough of an incentive for you to go back and break apart your form, because that's rather hard work. And so there's this question of incentives and disincentives with a play like this, which appears on in a print market that's not necessarily that interested in plays yet, and it's a relatively short play. And I was just going to ask, I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, because we didn't discuss this in advance. I know that Fair M, it's 12,600 odd words long. The average play of the period is about 20,000 plus words long. I know Jack Straw, The Life and Death of Jack Straw, beloved of this parish, is only 8,500 words, so even shorter. Is there a sense of the material coming to Danter? Is Danter deliberately picking short things, or are the others much longer and much more of the usual scale of theatre? Is this an outlier in Dante's work?
You're bringing me new information, and I quite like it. So the same year, so we've got Jack Straw, Fair M, obviously in a similar time period. Wounds of Civil War. Do you know how many words that one is?
Okay, right. We're going to do this
Oh,
live, aren't we? Okay,
yeah,
let me bring up my sheet. I may not have all of the word counts on them. So,
I'm
Wounds of
disappointed.
Civil War. Live spreadsheet action. Wounds of Civil War is that's a chunky one. That's 22,500. So that's your bog standard play length. Just double check that. Yeah.
We've also got Cobbler's Prophecy.
Cobblers is only 14,000. So that's closer to Fair M.
And Orlando Furioso.
Oh, I think that's a short one as well.
That is new information to me, and actually really quite interesting. Danter in 1594 seems to have an awful lot of work on.
Yeah.
So there is some sense in him taking on shorter manuscripts, also with this period of kind of exploration of whether this is going to be a sensible market to lean into, perhaps not spending too much time on plays. Makes sense. So yeah, no, it's great. I will
It
continue
seems to be varied. It does seem to be a varied. We got 8,500, 12,000, 14,000, 20 odd thousand. So it doesn't seem that there's a consistent pattern there. So, and that's probably just down to whatever manuscript he's got handed, or that he's bought. Doesn't necessarily mean a pattern in terms of the printer, more probably the supply of text. Anyway, short diversion there. And again, genre-wise, there's no consistency between what Danter is printing. They're all over the place in terms of, history play, tragedy, comedy. He's not discriminating to a market that we might determine.
No, and I think this is part of the conversation as well, is it seems that of the two publishers that he's predominantly using, Barley seems to be printing or asking to be printed more Queen's Men history plays, which seem to go to Thomas Creed, who is another printer, or music. And Cuthbert Berbie seems to be the person who's leaning more into plays, but he's distributing them amongst different printers. So as you say, it seems to be what Dante's receiving as opposed to what he's choosing, or necessarily there are different ideas at the moment being fielded around publishers choosing a specialty, which absolutely makes sense, them kind of having an area that they specialize in and particularly choose to print in. And it doesn't seem that Dante seems to do that. He's very well known for ballads and pamphlets, so smaller items that he can churn out quickly. You think of The Apprentice with Sir Alan Sugar, where people either choose the big money item or key rings, and you're going to shift 500 key rings, but are you going to shift a Porsche? Dante's a keyring guy. He chooses the small items that he knows he's going to be able to sell rather than being able to put everything or investing in just one large project. So he does lean more into ballads and pamphlets, and these playtexts seem to be the largest things that he does print.
Mm. So we've been talking about this, or you've been talking about this boomlet of printing in 1594. That there is this mini burst of printing of plays by Danter and others. What is sort of the trend that follows that moment in 1594? Because you talk of it as a boomlet. It's not that there is a boom and it's sustained. It's a little flash and then it dies. But then what happens over time?
No, you're absolutely right. It is this kind of flash in a pan moment where in 1594, out of almost nowhere, there are 20 play texts printed, and that fizzles out into 1595, 96, but into 97 and 98, it starts to build again. And by the time we get into 1599 and into the 1600s, there's play text everywhere. So it seems that 1594 was a trial run. Play text could take around 2 years to sell at a bookseller's. And also, if you owned the manuscript, you could do a second edition. And you see coming into 1597, 98, 99, a lot of the plays that are printed there are second editions where publishers are making the most of owning that manuscript and they're able to churn out a second copy of that to bring in more money. Once you purchase the manuscript, that's the bulk of your, or a good chunk of your expenses to print something. Once it's yours, it's yours. If you can get a second, third, fourth, fifth edition out of it, then wonderful. And it's those later years in the 1590s that really pick up second editions, and then you get more first editions coming through as well.
Yeah, so you've got a book or play market that is now becomes established by the end of the century.
Yes.
And of course, John Danter gets to enjoy all that, doesn't he?
No. Poor John Danter sadly passes away in 1599, 28th of October 1599, probably aged around 34. Not sure what the causes of death were, but it means that he is never in a position to reap the benefits of any second editions of the playtext that he printed.
Alas, alas. So we have a playlet boom. We then have sustained printing. We have a market. And it's so much clearer in that it's one of the things that dogs my life, which is that in the 17th century, plays are being printed, tens per year, first editions, on top of manuscripts. I mean, it just makes my life hell because I've just got so many plays to do. Great thing about the 1570s and 80s was that there's so little to do. It's really straightforward, and then it's just like these bloody printers turn up and start printing things that I've got to produce. It's just, damn you, John Danter, damn you.
Thanks. This isn't why I signed up for this. Thanks for everything, John Danter.
So I think we've covered our little journey there, and we may return to talk in more detail about some of the other things that Danter was printing. Where can we find you? What are you up to in the real world?
In the real world, I am still at the Shakespeare Institute. I am studying there for another 4 years on my PhD, halfway through. But there is some of my work out there on Tinternet about Thomas Nash and also about Danter. So that's one place you can find me.
And if you'd like to go and see Fair Em the Miller's Daughter of Manchester, and you happen to be in America, this podcast should go out before this happens. But Lord Denny's Players, who we have spoken to in the past, they're doing it in November in Ohio. So I'll put a link in the show description. If you're listening to this in the far distant future, it happened in the past. You've missed it. All that remains to thank my wonderful guest for being wonderful. Thank you very much, and goodbye.